Good evening and welcome to the Church of St. Ignatius Loyola. I am Father Dennis Yesalona. I have the honor of having served as pastor of this parish for the past 3 years. It's my responsibility just to welcome you to this presentation on opening doors, accessibility in historic houses of worship. I'm delighted that we had the opportunity to co-sponsor this program along with the New York Landmarks Conservancy Sacred Sites and Atchison Doyle Partners Architects. I also wish to acknowledge at this time the generosity of Frank E. Campbell Funeral Homes on Madison Avenue. They have underwritten the cost of this event as well as the reception that we are all invited to enjoy at the end of this presentation. And with us this evening is the General Manager, Bill Villanova, and his colleagues there to the left. So thank you, Bill, for your generosity. I was asked to introduce this topic by way of my introduction to the Church of St. Ignatius Loyola. As I said, I've been here for 3 years. My prior history as a general counsel for a couple of universities in the Boston area. And so I was very familiar with the ADA and ways in which to accommodate people into students, faculty, visitors to educational environments. So when I came here to the great city of New York, after having been in Boston all of those years, I presume that this church, because when I came as pastor, it was my first time coming to the church as pastor, I was surprised to see that we had no accessibility that was convenient for people with limited mobility. So I called together my finance committee and said we need to do a total review of the physical plant and identify ways in which we can make this environment more hospitable to those with limited mobility. And then we found our way to Mick Doyle at the architectural firm Atchison Doyle. Then we eventually found our way to Lou Martino, who is one of our presenters, and presented them with the task of identifying for us how can we make this historic site easily accessible to those who have a difficulty maneuvering, particularly walking. But we also added a few other features by way of an audio loop system to help with those with other forms of physical disabilities. The building we're in, just to tell you not unlike, I'm sure, the stories that we will hear from those representing other sacred sites throughout the city. This church was built in 1898. Well, the construction was completed in 1898. Construction began in 1895 by the architectural firm of Schickel and Ditmars. It was designated as a landmark due to its Italian Renaissance architecture in 1969. What I enjoy telling people is that we uncovered from the archives some of the billing for this church. It was constructed at the cost of $300,000. If you have not been to the church upstairs, hopefully you will have the opportunity at some time. You're more than welcome to join us just to visit or to come to one of our services. It is a magnificently beautiful church. $300,000. The pulpit alone now is been valued at $300,000. So out of curiosity, I looked for the current value of a dollar, an 1898 dollar is $3,025. So this church, hard to believe, if it were to be built today with the buying power of today's dollar, would be $907 million. Hard to believe, but it's a figure that sort of is mind-boggling. But it shows the generosity of those who founded this parish. The parish was founded in 1851 by Irish immigrants. If you're familiar with the history of New York City, the development after the Lower East Side became overcrowded, began to develop along the East River. As we know, Central Park was just farmland. Nobody lived in this area at all. But immigrants, particularly Irish, German, Hungarians, were moving up along the East River. There were orphanages, there were jails, there were hospitals on the islands here, and a Catholic population grew and priests to serve them. So the Irish immigrants asked the then Bishop of New York to found a parish so that they didn't have to take their either walking or their carriages down to an area approximately around 38th Street where the closest Catholic church was. So the Church of St. Lawrence O'Toole was founded in 1851. It was on 84th Street. The next building over is our grammar school. That was the site of the original church. While the then church was being constructed, services, masses were held, as you might know, on the second floor of an Irish pub. But it was through their nickels, dimes, and dollars that $300,000 eventually was raised to build the church that we are now in. The church, as I said, the parish established 1851, St. Lawrence O'Toole. Park Avenue was then 4th Avenue, as you may know, and at a point the train lines were depressed and Park Avenue was created. And in the 1860s they began the work, at least to get the permission from the Vatican and Rome to build a new church facing Park Avenue. And then the rest is history, as I said, construction beginning in 1895, then completed in 1898. And with any building built in that period, but all of you are more familiar with it than I, especially if you're architects or certainly in the Landmarks Preservation Commission and the Landmarks Conservancy of New York. What about accessibility? How do we get people into these environments? As I was beginning my pastory 3 years ago, not only did I come with an eye of a lawyer looking at access to this building, more poignantly, one of the first families that I met have a son who is unfortunately confined to a very heavy-weighted wheelchair. On Sundays, in this environment in which you now are, formerly the Church of St. Lawrence O'Toole, the lower part, the upper part was called St. Ignatius Loyola, but that's a story I can tell at another time. We will have approximately 350 to 400 people, family members down here, young families with young children that want to celebrate together and worship together. Upstairs at the same time simultaneously, we will have anywhere between 500 and 600 people at a very formal solemn mass. But how do you get the children and the families down here who want to worship together? So this family met with me in one of the parlors of the parish house. They could not bring their son with them because there was no accessibility into the parish house if a child or anyone was in a wheelchair or using a walker. And they told me their circumstances, pointed their finger at me and said, "Now what are you going to do about it?" And I took the challenge, and from that moment on was determined to do exactly what we're doing now. As you might see in the back here, there's a sign that says, "Your dollar's at work." Once we had a full evaluation of the program of needs here, we began a capital campaign because you can't do what you need to do or it needs to be done without money. And so in the process, as we were raising funds, we began the renovation projects. There is now a ramp in front of the parish house to allow easy access. This corner here will now have an elevator that will bring it from street level down to this lower area so that that family and all those with limited mobility will be able to worship in this environment. But more importantly, and I think it's true of all of those who represent sacred spaces, houses of worship, there is more than just a service that takes place. There are educational programs, there are musical programs, there are all kinds of programming. And what we do in this Church of St. Ignatius Loyola is say, welcome. We're a family. Join us. This is your home. And as with our own families, you want to make them accessible to everyone. And so that caught on. So we have called our campaign, Your Parish, Your Home. Invite people in. Make them feel at home here and welcomed in such a way that there will be no barrier to their joining us. And that's what we're about to do. And God bless all of those here who are architects, all of those here who represent faith traditions, to make that a real part of people's lives, the ability to be where they want to be, especially in moments of worship and enjoying a parish community. And I take this rather personally because my mother was born during the polio epidemic of the 20s and was confined to a wheelchair her whole life. And at my ordination to the priesthood, she had to be physically carried into the church that I was ordained in. And at that time, I said, never again will I allow that to happen if I have a position of responsibility. And I'm delighted that the people of this congregation acknowledge that as a need so that we could welcome into our environment those who wish to worship, enjoy each other's company, and just have a good old time. So, with that said, I'm delighted that we are hosting, at this point in our history, this extraordinary conversation about accessibility into historic houses of worship. And I am delighted. By the way, if you ever come to a service and I usually preach for at least 50 or 60 minutes. So if it seems long, they tell me it appears long, even though I assure you I only preach for 10. They say, boy, it felt like an hour. And so I'm delighted to introduce those who will moderate this panel discussion. Anne Friedland, who is the director of the New York Landmarks Conservancy Sacred Sites, and Colleen Heemeyer, who is the manager of grants and technical service at the New York Landmarks Conservancy. Anne and Colleen, the floor is yours.
Hey. Welcome all of you from near and far. We have a rector here from Ossining because the Episcopal Diocese pushed the word out to all of their parishes. And we have a church here from Middletown in Orange County as well. I'm Anne Friedman from the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and this is Colleen, as you heard. What is the Conservancy? It's a little bit confusing. Our name sounds like the Landmarks Commission. We have Caroline Kane Levy here from the Landmarks Commission, the regulatory agency that regulates landmarks in New York City. We're a private nonprofit, and the Sacred Sites program has been around for over 30 years to serve the special needs of historic religious properties, not just in New York City, but throughout New York State. So many of you here are architects who have worked on projects that we funded. Many of you here are with congregations or parishes that have applied for or received grants from our Sacred Sites program. And many of you, like this church, have participated in our annual open house in May, when we invite all of our grantees and historic religious sites all over the state to open their doors the same weekend to share their history, their architecture, and their many, many community programs. We do have AIA credits, which you can sign up for at the end of this program. So see Colleen at the end of the program to secure those. Thank you to our host, St. Ignatius Loyola, and to Atchison Doyle, who first proposed this workshop, and to the Frankie Campbell Funeral Home for helping underwrite it. I'm giving a shout out to Egbert Stolk from the Episcopal Diocese of New York, who helped us push out, so he's over there. He used to work at the Landmarks Commission with Caroline, and he worked on many of the projects that you're gonna see tonight when he was still at the commission. The Conservancy's grant and loan programs have always focused on the exterior repair and restoration of historic buildings. We're really good at roofs, at facades, and windows. We've hosted several workshops over the last 30 years that address accessibility, physical accessibility, but we've never managed to identify a funder so that our grants could actually pay for exterior accessibility projects. For the most part, congregations are on their own in fundraising to implement accessibility projects. But there are some foundations that will accept applications for grants for capital projects, and there's a handout at the entrance, one for upstate New York and one for New York City, of some foundations that might consider funding that kind of project. Religious institutions really should lead the way in welcoming people with disabilities. Not just the exteriors of our buildings, but also the spaces inside should be accessible. Readers' platforms, like this one, should be accessible, and the building should be open and accessible for open and welcoming. And many sites, many of you share space and host programming for children and for seniors. You welcome the public for cultural programs and social service programs and feeding programs. Accessibility is critical to all of those things. Tonight, we'll hear about accommodations of many kinds, not just ramps and lifts, and about why those accommodations should be a priority for faith communities. Thank you again for joining us.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Mark Thompson. I am the Senior Associate Director of Architecture with the Paralyzed Veterans of America in Washington, D.C. PVA's core mission is to sustain and improve the lives of catastrophically injured veterans from our armed services. We do most of our work as the architectural group with PVA, with the Veterans Administration, working on healthcare issues for veterans, but we also do quite a bit of work just for general public accessibility issues. We've been on design teams for stadiums and public facilities, particularly in the Washington, D.C. area, so we have a very keen focus on ADA. And since our organization, a high percentage of our members require mobility assistance devices or wheelchairs, our organization's primary ADA focus is centered on the removal of physical barriers. However, ADA is not just about ramps, elevators, or other physical improvements limited to the built environment. ADA requires the elimination of both physical and non-physical barriers, and we're going to have a lot of discussion about that later on tonight, with the goal to provide equal opportunity for all Americans. As we get started tonight in our conversation, I think it's important to recognize that ADA is not a building code. We're going to repeat that. ADA is not a building code. ADA is a civil rights law, and its purpose is intended to eliminate societal, employer, business practices that treat people differently because of their disabilities. In other words, it's a civil rights law to prohibit discrimination by providing equal aspects to everyone, to all aspects of life. Providing equal access to the built environment, services, and program expands inclusion, and we've already talked about that a little bit tonight, across the full spectrum of our population. And that inclusion, in my mind, is the true value of ADA, not just in religious facilities, but across our country. Building codes and standards are really just a byproduct of ADA. They were created simply to give building owners and architects and designers a set of guidelines and requirements and standards to meet while designing new buildings. If you think about road design, we always drive on the right side of the road in America. ADA is kind of the same way, so that a ramp is the same everywhere. Elevators are similar design, so that you're used to that byproduct. It's a standard so that you can follow and easily find your way through spaces. It's also important to know that although there is really not a national building code for ADA, there's a lot of different local municipalities that have their own special requirements. So when you're working on a project, it's important to learn those nuances and see if it impacts your project. It's also important that while religious entities are exempt from ADA, most building codes do apply to all types of buildings regardless of their use. And as we've talked about inclusion a little bit already tonight, I think it's important that aligning your organization with the word inclusion again, and being able to provide access to all of your spaces and all of your services and programs is an important part of ADA, whether it applies to you or not, or whether a building code applies to you or not. I think it's important as we move forward tonight. We're going to look at some really interesting projects, and at this point I think I'm going to turn it over to Lou to talk about some projects directly and show us some great pictures. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Good evening. My name is Lou Martino from Atchison Doyle. I am accompanied here by some other members of my office, Robert Lawton and James Black. With that, we would like to run through some very simple slides that show some ongoing, current and about to begin projects here, not only at St. Ignatius, but at Epiphany Episcopal Church and Mount Zion Baptist Church. With that, I'd like to invite Robert Lawton up to the podium to run through Zion Lutheran Church. I apologize.
Hello, everyone. I'm Robert Lawton from Atchison Doyle, and I'm going to talk briefly about one of our projects, Mount Zion Lutheran Church. The site is located on the corner of 145th Street and Convent Avenue in Upper Manhattan, and is located within the Hamilton Heights Sugar Hill Historic District. Looking at the screen, to the left is the site as it existed in 1940, and to the right as it exists today. One of the great things about this site is its great corner presence, and along with the adjacent parish house, the two really sort of adds to the identity and the charm of the historic district. Our scope on this project includes the restoration of the exterior of the church, minor changes to the interior, and most importantly, adding a new accessible route into the church. The new accessible route consists of an exterior ramp between the sidewalk and the church along 145th Street. The ramp enters directly into the existing vestibule and then into a small narthex and then ultimately into the sanctuary of the church. It was important to us that this accessible route maintains this procession because we didn't want one to feel like they were sort of entering in through the side of the church or the rear of the church. As shown, this accessible route also creates a direct connection between the sidewalk and this adjacent garden space to the left of the church. So, you know, the overall goal of this project wasn't just to create an accessible route between the sidewalk and the church, but to really engage this adjacent garden and to really enforce this church's corner presence and primary entrance on 145th Street. Thank you.
As I mentioned earlier, there's some ongoing projects here at St. Ignatius Loyola, and I'd like to indicate some of those here. What we did when we first arrived, as Father Yosalona mentioned earlier, is we did a quick study. Anyone hear me? Yes. We did a quick study and realized that very often, as is the case with religious campuses, they, as need and monies are available, and develop churches here, the school here, the record school here. While they're all connected, there isn't a traditional sense of circulation that allows them to get from one place to another. That being kind of been identified, we look at where existing vertical circulation is located, and we sought to try to get to those locations. We told to step over here. We did that. We identified some very obvious requirements with respect to access into the rectory, and we're welcome to go take a look at that right now. As is often the case with historic buildings, we need to sort of identify what we have, what it is that we can disturb as little as possible, what it is that we can achieve that will provide the greatest mobility access as possible. And in this instance, rather than looking at adding a ramp in the traditional sense, we looked at it in a negative way, and we looked at it more as if it were a pavement project or a landscape project. And with that, the little rework, we were able to incorporate a ramp that is very much not noticeable and having a large impact on the historic building itself. There was a quite nice dogwood tree that flanked the entrance. There was one on the left and one on the right. Very obviously, that was something that we needed to save, despite the minimum dimensions that had to be incorporated in the design spread. That said, it was quite successful. As you can see some pictures of these historic pavement, photographs around the holiday season. That dogwood tree has got
slight impediments to access that are just annoying enough to not make them accessible. What we've identified is a way to do that is an area that we share with a secondary entrance with the church. You may notice, if you look around at St. Ignatius Grammar School, that there is currently a method by which individuals can get into the Wallace Hall location that we are in now. However, it does require use of temporary ramps that St. Ignatius sets up. And our project, which was shortly, is going to eliminate that as a possibility or necessity.
Hello? Can everyone hear me? All right. I'll try to project. Small steps, still a huge impediment to mobility access. With that, we take a look at sort of bridging over some of these depressions, very small, a couple of steps here. And so by just adding a simple ramp in this location and reworking a lot of the historic railings, which is always a concern of ours, always of interest, and always an important aspect to the design. How can we leave this in a way that doesn't look like we've added a ramp on the front of the building? One of my little sort of pet peeves is I look for examples of ramps in historic architecture, and I could challenge you all to take a look for yourselves. Since antiquity, most buildings have been sort of presented in a way that you ascend, and it's part of the sort of arrival experience, and that tradition pervades today in many of our civic and religious buildings. So it becomes a challenge because all of those historic elements are there. They need to be preserved as part of the original fabric of the building, yet we need to improve the accessibility. And so as architects, that is our task, and that was what we seek to accomplish. Currently now, we're looking at 84th Street, the side where there is a long ramp that you would access here and go up and into the current entrance into the sanctuary one level above us. There isn't an opportunity to get to Wallace Hall right now, but what we have proposed is an elevator addition, and working with Landmarks, we were able to come up with a design that integrates very nicely with the historic fabric of the building, and we think is entirely an enhancement to the facade located on 84th Street. This addition balances with this small projection here on the north transept, and we'd be left with a construction that includes this vocabulary that is very similar to the original vocabulary of the building, using the same limestone, similar copper detailing, and steel windows. Here's the addition here. And while it is seemingly simple, it's very complex to sort of get your brain around the fact that you have an elevator that stops 2.5 places and has 2 doorways. If you take a moment and take a look at this slide, you'll see that you enter at grade. You can go up a half level, then exit and go down the ramp, which we have taken to be a platform now as part of our design, or you could descend down 1 level and arrive right behind me here at Wallace Hall. So that's currently what we've done and what we're planning on doing. I invite you to come back in about 6 to 8 months, and you can take a ride in the elevator here at St. Ignatius. With that, I'd like to invite James Black up to give a brief presentation of an installation that we're working on at Epiphany.
Thanks. Epiphany Church, located on 74th between 1st and 2nd, was a historically Czech church built in the late 1870s with the initial, let's see here, with the initial church building, and then later added on in the 1915s with what was the parish hall. But as typical as what you've seen with the majority of these churches is that there's the half flight down and a gigantic flight up that, as we've proved over history, has become very difficult for accessibility means into and out of the church, not only just for people with disabilities, but also with just normal people. In this instance, the stairs here have inclines of 9 inches, 10 inches, 11 inches in some instances, which is very difficult to just climb in general. Function coming in from the sidewalk, whether it be from birth all the way to the end through death, is that people, no matter in whatever capacity that they're in, always have to be able to get into and out of a building. And as we've learned over history, we have to take those cues and do better with that as we move through. The challenges with Epiphany, again, in particular with the staircase on the front stoop, is how do you address the upper levels, the sanctuary of the church, and how do you come down into the parish hall of the church? In this particular instance, what we've done on the design side is we've modified the exterior of the building using the same materials to have one grand staircase as opposed to 2 separate entrances, and then have basically lifted the elevations, the interior elevations of the building to accommodate the sidewalk. As people come into and out of the sidewalk, and Reverend Cole will get on into this during his presentation, is that the majority of the users in the parish hall are for homeless people, older people typically that have a hard time getting into and out of the church as a general, and there's a large contingency that comes into and out of the church, anywhere between 200 and 300 people a day that need to access these spaces. A lot of people have a hard time getting into and out of the church currently. So basically our design approach on this particular project was to meet the sidewalk to get people into the church on a more accommodating level. Again, this also takes cue with vertical transportation. So we've used vertical transportation in order to help get people up into the main body of the sanctuary as well as into lower portions of the church. And there's also a school portion of this that will get children up into the main body of the church. As you can see, this is kind of an existing shot of what it is to what the proposed plan is. The idea is to get more entries from the sidewalk into the main portion of the church, where people will then be able to either go straight into the parish hall, straight from the sidewalk, and then either be able to take an elevator up into the sanctuary, or be able to go into more accessible stair means to get you up into the sanctuary from the sidewalk level. And that essentially captures the accessibility on that.
Thank you, James.
The clicker.
Good evening. I'm Caroline Kane Levy from the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. First off, I'd like to thank the Conservancy, Anne and Colleen, for inviting us to participate in this very important event. The LPC believes that historic structures can and should be made accessible. We are committed to working with all property owners, but especially religious congregations, towards this goal. And while we will always be looking for the least intrusive ways to achieve accessibility, we aim to have solutions comply with all codes, including ADA, national, state, and local standards. The agency has a dedicated staff who specifically handle all applications for buildings owned by religious institutions and who are experienced in their unique needs. These staff can provide personal attention and technical assistance, as well as expedite approvals for religious institutions. One of them is here this evening. I'd like to acknowledge James Rusiello, who's sitting over there, and he's available to work with you not only on barrier-free access, but on other projects as well. And I'd also like to acknowledge Egbert Stoke, who was also in that position until recently when he left for the Episcopal Diocese. What is the Landmarks Preservation Commission? Established in 1965, the Landmarks Preservation Commission is the mayoral agency responsible for protecting and preserving New York City's architecturally, historically, and culturally significant buildings and sites. Simply put, the Research Department designates buildings, sites, and historic districts, and the Preservation Department regulates changes by reviewing applications and issuing permits. This past year, the Commission issued approximately 11,600 permits. Of all those permits issued, 95% met criteria allowing the staff level approval. Only 5% did not meet those criteria and resulted in commission level approval following a public hearing. Oops. These are samples of the types of permits we issue. At staff level, we have the certificate of no effect when Department of Buildings filing is required and the permit for minor work when it's not. Most barrier-free access requires a DOB filing. The certificate of appropriateness is issued when the proposed work is not eligible for a staff permit and goes to a public hearing for a full commission review. This type of work can vary from something as small as window replacement that does not meet the rules to new building within a historic district. The fact that an application may not qualify for staff level approval is not a rejection. It's just a different process to follow in order to gain approval. And it's not something to fear. The Commission's rules were amended on January 21st of 2019 to allow staff to review and approve many more types of applications for work on landmark properties. In the past, barrier-free access was not covered by the rules, and almost all applications of this nature went to a public hearing. On our website, we've created a downloadable PDF with the address shown on the slide here. Specifically, Section 2-18 of the rules deals with barrier-free access. Some basic concepts influence formulation of the rules. Often there are more than one way to achieve accessibility, and staff is going to ask you if you've explored interior alterations, which will lessen the impact or eliminate the need for exterior alterations. We'll be guiding you towards the least intrusive solution with the least impact on significant exterior architectural features. We do differentiate between buildings designated as individual landmarks and those within historic districts. And certain things may meet the rules for a church or a synagogue within a historic district, but may not qualify for a staff level permit if the building is an individual landmark. The project shown here at St. Mark's on the Bowery was extremely complex, with 2 different ramps, changes to landings, and requiring approval from the Parks Department because of the unusual site. But we got through it together, and in the end, it resulted in a very nice solution. Since there are different ways to make a building accessible, I'll start with the simplest. Staff can issue a permit to lower an existing entrance at a building in a historic district to provide accessible at-grade entrance, provided that the entrance is dropped or raised minimally, 18 inches at a primary entrance and 30 inches at a secondary entrance. And also that the work does not alter historic fabric and that the new door has similar proportions to the historic door. Furthermore, sidewalks can be sloped to meet the entrance, which might be the simplest solution of all. Door and surround alterations can be made at staff level at buildings in historic districts if the proposal retains as much historic fabric as possible. Non-historic doors can be replaced if the new door recalls the historic. The opening may be widened up to 8 inches to meet code, provided that the door surround is recreated in kind. And the operation of the new door may be altered to meet required clearances, including varying the width of paired doors. Oops. A door actuator may be part of a larger installation or may be a simple way in itself to provide access. The rules cover both wall plates and freestanding posts. The installation should be small and unobtrusive and mounted in non-decorative or non-historic surfaces and finished to harmonize with the adjacent facade. Handrails should be simply designed and mounted without damaging or detracting from significant architectural features. Existing ironwork or low masonry walls may be modified to meet accessibility requirements. Ramps without handrails may be a solution when the grade change is minimal. LPC rules allow for this type of ramp for both buildings in historic districts and individual landmarks. The requirements are that the installation will not damage historic fabric, that the materials match the facade or are utilitarian with a neutral finish, and that the ramp is as short as possible with no switchbacks. Ramps with handrails can only be approved at staff level for buildings in historic districts and not individual landmarks. The rules require that they be located within a deep recessed areaway, that the installation not disrupt the facade's composition, and that the steps and landing should retain their historic orientation. This is a ramp that does not meet the rules because it's not in an areaway, but it went to a public hearing. The rules cover both wheelchair platform lifts and chair lifts on rails for buildings in historic districts only. The requirements specify a minimal removal of historic fabric, a discrete location in a recess or partially obscured by existing areaway features, or otherwise not disruptive of the facade's composition. Lifts should be able to be stored in the down position and finished to blend with adjacent materials. If your project does not meet the rules, there's always the option of appearing before the commission at a public hearing. Our staff is here to work with you and to guide you through the process. The public hearing track does include an appearance before the community board, which will comment and make recommendations to the commission. Public hearings are held approximately 3 times a month, and complete application is due approximately 3 weeks before the hearing. The panel is comprised of 11 commissioners appointed by the mayor. At the hearing, you'll present your proposal. The public and other interested parties will comment, and the commissioners will deliberate and then vote. In almost all cases, these types of applications are approved in one form or another. The commissioners may ask for some modifications before the final approval, but I need to reiterate that the commission and the staff are well aware of the importance of accessibility and are supportive and willing to help make this happen. We look forward to working with you. Please contact our Public Information Associate, Victoria Pinocchio, with general questions on how to file, or if you don't know whether your building is a landmark. And feel free to reach out to me with more specific questions. Our contact information is on the screen. Thanks.
I'm going to turn this over to some of our clergy to speak about their experiences with accessibility at their institutions. And
Good evening, everyone. I'm Rabbi Serge Lipp. I've served for the last 22 plus years as the senior rabbi at Brooklyn Heights Synagogue, located at 131 Remsen Street. 25 years ago, we moved the synagogue from its first home at 117 Remsen Street, and we carried everything literally 5 doors down to our current building at 131. About 5 years ago, we also acquired 127 Remsen Street, which had been residential, and it is now our annex, which we are in the process of conjoining the two buildings and lots. My expertise is obviously not in elements of design or law. Rather, I speak from the perspective of a congregational leader who is hoping that our community opens its doors, its membership, and its appeal to everyone. Quoting the words of the prophet Isaiah, "My house shall be a house of prayer for all people." Whether we make that happen is obviously a choice. We speak about accessibility. That's the word that's up there. I'd like to introduce 2 other words. In addition to access, which to me is the most limiting term that we probably use tonight, and there's a reason for it, there's the question of welcome. Does access equal welcome, or is it just access? And is welcome the same thing as invitation? In our synagogue community, we ask this question all the time. It's one thing to be welcoming, that's nice. It's another thing to be inviting. And that means we have to actually be standing outside of the building and consider the perspectives of differently sized and abled people as they encounter the frontage of our building. We want to be a community. And I think most of us who lead congregational communities would say that congregations are self-selecting. But the truth is, everyone who deals with an edifice recognizes that that edifice is also self-limiting. Our job is to see our edifice from the perspective of those who are differently abled than ourselves. As was mentioned before, my experience with most houses of worship, especially very beautiful houses of worship, is that they seek grandeur. And when we seek grandeur, our eyes tend to go, but not. Even though here in New York, most of us know to start by looking. Those attempts at grandeur in you know the line from Fiddler, one staircase going up, one staircase going down, and one going nowhere just for show. I'm literally in the midst of a conversation about a staircase that may end up going nowhere just for show. Those staircases which my original project management committee loved so much they could not get rid of because it was so beautiful, is thankfully going to pass into history so that we can create an open space that we really need. We limit the engagement too often of those who have a different perspective, different motion, when we can't see past the beauty of the current structure of our building. To do that, we have to invite in those who have different perspectives, different heights, different widths, different modes of mobility. So Brooklyn Heights, you know, is the first historic district. Yay us. Sometimes I really wonder about how much that's yay us. Our historic brownstone originally at 117. Before that, we were resident in churches. Thank you to most synagogues of our generation. We're celebrating 60 years on Hanukkah this year. We were in Grace Church. Our first phone number was at Grace Church. We still do our high holy days because we're never going to fit everyone in our building at Plymouth Church of the Pilgrims. Thank you, Reverend Beecher. Most brownstones, as you heard, have either a garden level or a parlor level. There's no street level in Brooklyn Heights unless you're going into one of those, on Montague Street, one of those businesses. But in the residential area and mimicking that in the houses of worship, there are these lovely stairways going up and these stairways, and you can't get in the building. Something to think about, garden and parlor. So when we were at 117, it was not quite on the vision of the community, but before I arrived, we had been making a decision. We had outgrown our space, and so thankfully we moved from one building in the historic district to another building in the historic district. Thankfully, neither building was landmarked as an individual landmark. I want to remind you that 9 times out of 10, your house is unlikely to be landmarked, unless you're very blessed. And then someone else is going to speak about that kind of a blessing. I don't get to deal with the blessing of a landmarked building, only a historic district. We realize, so here's the thing everyone's been walking around, houses of worship are legally exempted from ADA compliance. That's a bad thing from my point of view. I don't think that any religious leader actually wants to be exempted from ADA compliance. But a decision was made in 1990 in July when they adopted the law to exempt religious institutions for fear of the impact it might have on some of those historic properties. They certainly didn't have my building in mind. That is a fine consideration. My leadership in 1994, as we thought about purchasing a larger brownstone, asked the question, who are we? How do we want to be perceived by the community that is around us? How is the front of our building representing who we are in the community? And they made 2 decisions. When we acquired the former men's eating club, the Brooklyn Club, We did very little change to the interior. Boy, I wish we had been able to do more. It still looked and smelled like a men's eating club throughout most of the building. But we had a commitment to accessibility, and so the two things we did before we renovated one bit of the main building is we put an interior elevator into that building, which was an adventure, and we put an exterior lift onto the outside because we wanted everyone to have access to the building. Now, just because you're exempt from ADA doesn't mean you're exempt from the approval of the LPC. So it's really important to get to know the LPC and seek their help, because no matter what you do, you're going to have a certificate of no effect, or a variety of other certificates that you're going to need to have. But it's really important to know about that, and as you've heard, not be afraid. There are people who've gone down this road before, including houses of worship in Brooklyn Heights. I have spent a fair amount of time talking with my friends in the clergy. I'm very proud that one of our local churches is now First Unitarian, is actually getting its own accessibility taken care of, thanks in some part to a grant from the Conservancy. I don't know if it made it out. I had shared with Colleen, and if you're interested, there's a wonderful inventory. Colleen,
We're going to email it out to folks after.
There's a list of resources I want to send, and instead of having you type that into your computer, I thought I would just email you the links afterwards so it would be easier.
So a wonderful thing you can do to empower your congregation and to bring the notion of accessibility in all of its forms to regular light in your conversation. Of course, there's Disability Awareness Month in the Jewish community. That's an important part of our consideration. We have a number of differently abled members of our congregation who are making sure that they are part of our conversation about what it is to worship. Just to offer you some very quick highlights. Here are the sorts of things you might want to think about. Some of these don't apply to us because, parking lot and building entrance. We have a building entrance, no parking lot. Signage. Signage is sometimes about visibility, right? Restrooms. Worship center. Classrooms where children learn, and a host of other additional items. As an annual inventory to ask, because this isn't something you do once. You want to, on an annual basis, ask the question, how are we making our house accessible, welcoming, inviting to those who have different modes and styles of entry and participation? Thank you.
Reverend Cole, I don't know if you want to speak from your seat or up here.
Well, it's an honor to be here this evening, and just to give you a little background about Epiphany and a little background about myself, I've been in the Episcopal Diocese of New York since 2002, and my first experience with Landmarks was in the city of Yonkers, where, as you'll see in the little bios, I was president of the Landmarks Commission in the city of Yonkers. And then from Yonkers, I moved to Staten Island, where I served for the last 10 years, and at St. John's Episcopal Church, just at the base of the Verrazano Bridge as you come in from Brooklyn. And St. John's, as a landmarked building, went through two devastating storms. The first one was the nor'easter of 2010 that ripped off the entire, ripped off about 40% of the roof of the church, and then the rains came, and the rain just fell all the way through the entire church and flooded the church. And as we were working with Landmarks to move forward with those renovations and repairs, and we were getting near to the end of those, Hurricane Sandy came along and completely decimated a 175-foot steeple that was 170 years old. So we worked very, very closely with New York City Landmarks and have found it a just an excellent process. Very helpful information, good guidance, and I will have to say for us, one of the blessings was a very light touch of just gently helping us understand the buildings that we were stewards of and how best we could continue that stewardship for future generations. And then in February of this year, I was invited to come and take on the Epiphany Project. The Church of the Epiphany was founded in 1843. It currently is sited at the corner of East 74th and York Avenue. We front the avenue. And not quite a year ago, Epiphany was approached by Weill Cornell Medical Center that wanted to expand some student dormitory space. And that was at about the same time that Epiphany was realizing that our programming at the parish had exceeded our square footage, that there literally were hundreds of people moving through the building every day, and we were just, the building was overutilized. And even though the church had made some commitments for accessibility, especially around ramps and these types of things, it just was not adequate for the future needs of the parish. And that was about the time that Jan Hus Presbyterian was realizing that they could no longer realistically maintain a building that far exceeded their resources to maintain or to really use in a functional way. So we were able to purchase their building and allow them to have the resources that they needed to move a little further up on the east side, up to 92nd, and purchase a building more in scale with their current ministry and mission and worshiping life, and allowed Epiphany to move into a much larger facility. So with that, we purchased this property, which probably about doubles to maybe triples the amount of program space we have. And I have to tell you, working with Jimmy Black and Mick and Evan and all the rest of the team from Atchison Doyle, I'm amazed at how we thought we had so much space and now we're trying to cram everything in, right? And that means digging out subcellars and raising floors and bringing things into a situation that allows this building, this 19th century landmark, because it in the community, it's not formally landmarked by the city of New York, but it's a landmark to that neighborhood, and it's a landmark on the Upper East Side, bringing that building into the 21st century in a way that allows it to function as an asset to the community. Not only an asset to our own worshiping community, but an asset to the larger community as it relates to our preschool that we have, as it relates to the community programs that we support, and such as the Carter Burden Network and the 6-day-a-week lunch program that happens, which incidentally, we've now moved that lunch program to our York Street address. So every Sunday afternoon, the staff at Epiphany take out all the chairs and move all the items at the altar and choir pews and set up for lunch for 120 people. And Monday through Friday, we serve lunch at our property. And then Saturday morning, staff come back in, take down all the tables and chairs, reset the place for worship. And we're going to be doing that now for the next 18 months until we're able to move into this facility. I want to mirror so much of what has already been said this evening, and I don't need to repeat it because I've agreed with everything that has been said, but I would add one other perspective. As we make commitment as people of faith, as faith leaders, and as professionals in the field of architecture, those of you who are in that field, I have to say that as a parish priest, the thing that I do struggle with as we make the hard decisions about what the space will look like is exacerbated by the fact that many of the architectural decisions that were made in houses of worship were made not just because we wanted to create a monumental aesthetic experience of the transcendent, but they have religious, theological, and sacramental the religious, theological, and sacramental statements that we're making. The reason the altar is high and lifted up is because it's a statement of our understanding, and it seeks to reach inside the soul and the life of those who come into the worshiping community to bring them into those moments of transcendence that come to all faith traditions. And so when we start talking about accessibility beyond just the exterior entrances into the church, it really is about how does the choir get up to the choir loft? How does a priest or religious leader or a rabbi who perhaps has some mobility challenges as they age or just as their health changes, how are they able to continue to function within that worship space in ways that allow accessibility but also maintains the integrity of the sacramental, theological, liturgical aspects of that house of worship? So these are also some of the questions that I've been working with Mick and specifically Jimmy and Evan and their team as we take a Protestant Presbyterian worshiping space and then bring into it a stronger sacramental incarnational understanding as Anglicans. How do we do that while still maintaining enough maintaining our commitment to being fully accessible? So it's an amazing project. We're very excited to be working with Landmarks, with the Conservancy, with Friends of the Upper East Side, with Atchison Doyle, because Epiphany sees this as their home for the next 100 to, by God's grace, 200 or more years, and making sure that we're making the right decisions now to make it not only accessible, but welcoming and inviting. And thank you so much, Rabbi, for those words, because that really is, I think, why all of us are here this evening, because we understand it is more than just about putting in an elevator, more than just putting in a ramp. It's letting people know that in this day and in the tenor of our political systems and our society and the difficulties we're having in that national conversation that we're about, that in our houses of worship, every human being is welcome. Every human being is invited. Whatever the journey and the path that you are on, and we want to make sure that not only you can get into the building, but that that building works for you. Because whether you're a 2-year-old coming to the preschool or you're 92 years old and you're coming to the senior lunch, the building has to work for you. The bathrooms have to work for you. The lighting has to work for you. The sound has to work for you. The flooring has to work for you. And on and on and on that list goes. So that's the journey that we're making. And thank you all for the opportunity to just share a little bit of that story with you this evening.
Father Camus from St. Jean Baptiste, we left the Jean out of the program, I'm sorry about that, St. Jean's, is here, and his building is an individual landmark in this neighborhood as well. And both Rabbi Lipp and Father Camus are on the Conservancy's board, so I want to thank them for their service and participating tonight.
I think my experience is a little different from everybody else in that I became pastor in 1970. I don't know, I was 38 years old, whatever that was. I'm 71 now. And I've been at the church more or less the whole time. And when I got there, I found out that the church had no money, which really thrilled me. I went to school there as a child. I went from 1st grade to 8th grade there at that school. And I became a priest, the order that's there, the Congregation of Blessed Sacrament. And then I was very happy to go there as a pastor. I was new. And the first week I was there, 50 pounds of limestone fell onto Lexington Avenue off the facade of the church. And that started this thing, this working on the building. It took us 12 years to do the entire exterior. We have 7 copper roofs. We have 2 cupolas and 1 dome, plus a lot of other types of copper roofs, so that all had to be changed. This church was built, my church was much more expensive than this one. It was $600,000, and that was in 1910. And when I did just the dome the roof of the dome was $600,000 when we were doing it later on. So all that type of thing is, just very expensive, very challenging. And my suggested topic is, what do you do with your community? How do you get your community on board? Well, first of all, I just looked very pathetic. I was a very young priest, so they all felt sorry for me. And I told, I was very frank. I said, we really have no money. It's just not there, and we're going to have to do everything little by little by little as we find out what the problems are, where we want to go with it. And people really backed me up. They were, I can't complain about anything. It just really moved along over those 12 years. But the type of challenges that we had was the same as this place. It was very grand, very grand. 3 staircases in the front, no way to move around the building, very close to another high-rise on Lexington, and close to another building nearer to 3rd Avenue. So we had these little slits on both sides of the church, and that was the only way we could get in. So we, with the landmarks, we were working with them, and what we decided to do was to gut one of the bell towers and to put in an elevator there. It's not a very elegant entrance to the elevator, but it gets you there. It's big enough for any size wheelchair, and we use it very, very often. We're at a point now we need to replace it because it was put in so long ago. It's almost 30 years old. So a new one's coming in, which is another headache for me, but that's what you do. You just keep doing it. But I had a sense of the building, and I had a sense of what went on there because I was a kid there at school, and I was a pastor there for 12 years. 14 years, then I left for a while, came back again as pastor. So I have a good sense of the place. I know every nook and corner of it. So I know how to kind of get around things. And I think there's something behind that wall. I remember it from a long time ago. We knock it down, there's something there. So those type of things, that's important that you have history. Somebody has to have the history of the building. In these old buildings, it's really very important, I think. So I was relying a lot of times on the elderly people in the parish who were there for 50 years, 60 years. Do you remember this? What was there? Who was, that type of thing was very, very helpful. And it got them on board, too. So that's another thing. I was young. I didn't know anything about construction. So every time I met someone, oh, you're an architect? Oh, come and look at this. Oh, you're an engineer, come and look at this, So I was getting a lot of free information, at least so when I did talk to the architect I was hiring, I wasn't totally, from Pluto. I knew a little bit about it. So that was also helpful, but to really, to reach out into the community and get them to give you opinions. I found that very, very helpful. And the more people that snooped around the building, I was, taking people up and down staircases and scaffolding and everything, and they loved it. They just loved it, and they really got into the whole process. And they also put up with a lot of mess. 12 years, we had various messes everywhere, all over the building, and we're starting that again now. We're hitting with scaffolding once again. But, again, it's their project. If it could be their project, they're happy with the inconvenience. They'll put up with it. So that's a lot of important part, I think, of these long projects to get that good feeling from the congregation, to really invite them in. I think that one of the main things I would say, don't be afraid to get people in. Don't be afraid to have tours of a horrible site that needs to be redone. Tell them why it's horrible. Tell them what needs to be done, what we can do. Listen to them. And when they get on board, it's wonderful. When I took over that church, I had no idea how much money we needed to spend to get everything ready. We had to put ramps in. We had to put elevators in. We had to totally redo the exterior and totally redo the interior when it was all over with. So I got there was $100,000 in savings, and when I left, we had spent $7 million on the building, and we still had nothing in the bank, but that's okay. We got all that work done. But that's the way, again, they were with me. And if you just invite them in, keep inviting them in. I had a couple of people who really could not walk. They just could not walk, and they wanted to come into the building. We found a way to get them in. They were the best advertising we could have. They went out and they said, this is what he wants to do, this is what he wants to do. It's wonderful. Support, that's what you want. Just really get them in. Don't be afraid to invite them in and to use their talents. Make believe you don't know anything and get them to help you. It's a really wonderful way of working. That's my wisdom. Okay.
Rachel's going to bring us home, and then we'll have questions.
Hi, so yes, I'm closing us out. My name is Rachel Pardo, and I am a program officer at the New York Community Trust here in New York City. The trust is New York City's community foundation, and we make grants focused on essentially everything that you could think of that makes New York City great: arts, education, workforce development, all focused on the 5 boroughs. So I wanted to provide a little bit of context just about what we're talking about tonight. First of all, New York City's disability community is about 1 million people, a little more actually, a quarter of which are children under the age of 18, and more than 500,000 are people with mobility disabilities. You have to also remember that it includes people with invisible disabilities, such as learning disorders, developmental disabilities, mental health disabilities, chronic illnesses, deafness, blindness. It's the largest and the most diverse minority group here in New York City, and it's only growing as baby boomers are continuing to age. So we're looking at a very large population of people here in New York City. It's also the only minority group that anyone can join at any time. I mean, hopefully there is never an accident, but that's the case. So the trust does not support capital campaigns, and we don't make grants for construction. But recognizing that accessibility and inclusivity is so important, we do make a lot of grants to help with programmatic accessibility. So one project that I wanted to highlight tonight is some work that we're doing with the Historic House Trust. I'm not sure if people are familiar with the Historic House Trust, but it is the organization, it's a nonprofit here in New York City, that works with city government to preserve and help improve the 23 historic houses here in the city. Some of those historic houses date back to the 1600s, and most of them are from the 18th century. So the Historic House Trust recognized that they wanted to open up their houses to the community, they wanted to make sure that the programming was inclusive, and recognized at the same time that it was going to be very hard to make a lot of physical accessibility changes given the nature of the houses. It's very hard for some of these houses to even get up to the second floor. It's almost impossible to do so. But they identified a need, and they knew it was important, and they knew that they wanted to make sure that they were welcoming to the community and able to educate the community on the history of these beautiful spaces. So they identified a consultant, and they brought the consultant in to start thinking about how they can make those educational programs and some of those other types of the houses accessible to the community and welcoming, as the rabbi said. So a lot of the work is focused on programmatic accessibility. It's focused on lighting. So for example, just looking in this room, the lighting may be appropriate for a person with a sensory processing disorder who might be overwhelmed with bright lights, but then a person with low vision may find it very hard to navigate the room. Website design. There are some federal standards in terms of website design to make sure that the websites are accessible to readers, to screen readers. Even so simple as paint. So again, looking at this room, a person with low vision, it's very hard for them to navigate a space unless there's contrast and they're able to see shadow. So even with a paint job, just making sure that the ceiling and the floor borders have black paint or dark paint so that the person with low vision can navigate. Something that was very important for them was programming for kids and programming for parents and children with disabilities. A lot of times parents didn't feel comfortable coming to these spaces because a child with autism was going to have a challenging day, and the parent didn't know if they would be shunned and ashamed and have to excuse themselves, or whether they would be really accepted and feel welcomed in that space. So identifying separate rooms to be able to take a break, putting it out there explicitly that we are okay with this. If you need to come and go, that's fine. Just making sure that they were inviting and welcoming to those various needs. Messaging and marketing. even so much as the pages, making sure that there's a contrast on the page so that a person with low vision is able to read it easily. So really just thinking about what changes they can make in their everyday practices and their programming to ensure that it's welcoming and inviting and able to reach out to a community that is there in New York City. It's a very large community. It's just often doesn't feel invited and welcomed and able to access those spaces. So I wanted to talk about a few big pieces of kind of the disability rights movement. So the first is the curb cut effect. So if anyone is familiar with this, it's the recognition that any accessibility improvements are, yes, going to benefit people with disabilities, but overall they're going to benefit and be valuable for a much broader community. So we think about sidewalks, and when curb cuts were implemented in, I think, the 80s or the 70s for the most part, but definitely the 90s with the implementation of the ADA. Yes, those curb cuts where you're able to get down to the street were beneficial for people who use wheelchairs, but also think about parents who are pushing strollers, people who had a temporary disability, like a woman who's pregnant, people who are pulling their bag, delivery people with carts. Even when we were in here today, I know Anne was behind me or in front of me, lugging down a suitcase down the stairs. Just imagine if there was a ramp. It would have been very, beneficial for someone who needed it because they used a wheelchair, but also for someone who was pulling in a suitcase at the end of the night and was tired, I'm sure. So the curb cut effect could be applied to any number of your programs that, yes, it's going to be open and accessible and welcoming to people with disabilities, but it also might be welcoming to a broader community that you want to make sure that you're opening your doors to them anyway. The other piece is that when you're thinking about programming, it's always more cost-effective and efficient to include these accessibility measures and these discussions from the beginning, because retroactively making improvements and changes is challenging and also more expensive. But this brings me to my final point, is that when you are having these conversations and these discussions and thinking about this, it is entirely important to make sure that you're including people with disabilities in the conversations. The mantra in the disability rights movement is nothing about us without us, so that nothing about disability should be discussed unless a disabled person is in the room. And you think about with any other scenario, you wouldn't develop a program for parents without talking to parents first. And that's the same case here. So when you're having these conversations, reach out to your community. You may not know who they are, but if you put it out there that you want to talk to people who have disabilities, they will come. Or there are other resources where you'd be able to reach out and try to find consultants and experts to speak with. So reach out to your community, really get a sense of what they need, because again, there are a number of different needs. Like the lighting I said, some people may need something, other people may need something else. So it's very important to talk to the community and make sure that they are valued and present in these conversations, because ultimately it's your community, they're there. It's just you need to make sure that you're allowing them to come in and making sure that you're inviting them to come in at the same time. So I think those are two big pieces to take with you when you're going in this journey. And lastly, ask questions, be humble, take a step back, because you may think you know everything, but unless you've lived the experience of a person with a disability, you haven't. So just take a step back, listen, be humble, and I think those are going to get you very far when you're starting this work. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Again, we're going to follow up with you by email with a survey and some additional resources. If you have any questions, feel free to email us with questions afterwards. The AIA credits form is at the table at the front before the architects leave. Take care of that. But let's have the reception and meet each other. Thank you so much.